The year was 1947 and America found itself in a period of post-war reconstruction. Cities were expanding outward, and prosperity was beginning to bloom across the nation. But deep within the remote hollers of Harlan County, Kentucky, time had apparently stopped moving forward altogether. The Jackson property lay, situated 3 miles from the nearest dirt road, reachable only by a treacherous footpath that wound through dense forest and crossed 2 streams, completely devoid of bridges. For decades, the locals had whispered about the family dwelling out there. The ones who never ventured into town, never attended church services, never sent their young ones to school. It was Deputy Marshal Robert Clayton who ultimately discovered the cabin. He had been conducting a search for a missing person, a drifter last observed heading toward the eastern ridges when he happened upon the deteriorating structure. The roof had partly collapsed, and vegetation had reclaimed most of what once had been clearing. What struck Clayton immediately was the complete absence of sound. No birds sang their songs, no insects hummed their buzzes. Even the air itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation. Inside, the cabin presented itself as a time capsule filled with despair. Crude furniture constructed from mountain timber occupied the single room. A stone fireplace commanded one wall entirely, its mantel carved with initials and dates reaching back as far as 1847. But it was the floor that captured Clayton's attention. Several boards appeared newer than those surrounding them, deliberately positioned to hide something below. When he managed to pry them loose, the smell of decay and dampness rushed upward instantly. Within the shallow cavity rested a rusted metal box secured with wire and sealed with wax. Inside lay Marie Jackson's records, dozens of pages written in crumbling handwriting on whatever materials she could locate. Pages torn from books, the backs of seed packets, even birch bark sheets. Her documentation spanned 43 years from 1889 to 1932, reading like a gradual descent into biological catastrophe. Marie Jackson had entered the world in 1871, the daughter of siblings Thomas and Elizabeth Jackson. Her records began matter-of-factly, listing names and birth dates. With the precision of someone aware, she was documenting something terrible indeed. Thomas Jackson had married his own sister after their parents died in 1868, leaving them completely alone on that isolated homestead. Together, they produced 8 children. Marie was the 5th among them. The entries grew increasingly disturbing with each turned page. Marie described her siblings with clinical detachment, noting physical abnormalities appearing with greater frequency as the family tree collapsed inward upon itself. Her brother James arrived deaf and blind in one eye. Sister Ruth never achieved height beyond 4 feet and could not speak with clarity. Brother Samuel possessed twisted limbs preventing proper walking. The youngest, Martha, died at 3 years from seizures. Marie described with heartbreaking detail. But Marie's records revealed something darker still. She documented how the pattern perpetuated into the next generation as well. In 1889, at 18 years of age, Marie delivered a son. The father was her brother James. She wrote of this union with neither shame nor pride, simply accepting it as a fact of their existence. This was simply how things functioned in the Jackson Hollow. This represented all they knew or understood. Deputy Clayton remained seated in that ruined cabin for 3 hours, reading by lantern light while afternoon shadows lengthened around him. The pages detailed births, deaths, marriages that weren't truly marriages, children who simultaneously were cousins and siblings, a genetic entanglement producing increasingly severe consequences with each passing year. Marie had attempted tracking everything, perhaps hoping someone would eventually understand, would provide help, would halt the cycle that seemed unstoppable once it had begun. Her son with James received the name Thomas after her father and uncle combined. Young Thomas entered life with a cleft palate and a defective heart. He survived merely 2 years. Marie's next child arrived in 1892, fathered by another brother, Samuel. This daughter, named Elizabeth, initially appeared healthy, but developed seizures before reaching her first birthday. She lived to age 7. The record showed Marie produced 13 children between 1889 and 1914. 9 of them died before reaching age 10. The 4 survivors bore the unmistakable marks of their tangled heritage. Marie documented absolutely everything. Twisted spines, missing fingers, eyes incapable of focus, minds never developing beyond childhood capabilities, bodies failing in ways she could barely describe. Clayton discovered photographs tucked between the yellowed pages. Faded images revealed a family that seemed to embody suffering itself. Faces looked simultaneously young and ancient simultaneously. Bodies were misshapen in ways that turned the deputy's stomach. But what disturbed him most were their eyes. Every single person stared at the camera with the same hollow, knowing expression, as if they understood exactly what they were and what they had become. The final entries in Marie's records dated to 1932. By then, she had reached 61 years and was writing about her grandchildren, children born to her surviving offspring, who had perpetuated the family's isolated patterns. She wrote about a great-granddaughter born without proper swallowing ability, dying of starvation despite desperate feeding attempts. She wrote about twin boys who shared organs in ways making them inseparable until infection claimed them both. She wrote about giving up entirely. We are cursed by our own blood. Marie had written in shaking script, "What we have done cannot be undone. The mountain holds our shame, and we cannot leave because we are the shame itself. Let whoever finds this understand. Isolation is its own kind of violence." Deputy Clayton emerged from that cabin as dusk settled over the Kentucky mountains. He carried the metal box beneath one arm, its contents feeling heavier than metal and paper had any right to feel. When he reached town 3 hours later, covered in mud and visibly shaken, he proceeded straight to the county sheriff's office and placed the box upon the desk. "One need to find them," he said simply, clearing his throat. "Whatever's left of them, we need to locate them." The investigation following Marie Jackson's discovery became one of the most intensive efforts in Kentucky state history. Sheriff William Hodges assembled a team of deputies, a state social worker named Patricia Morrison, and Dr. Edmund Cartwright, a Lexington physician specializing in genetic conditions. Their mission stood clearly defined: locate any surviving members of the Jackson family and document what decades of isolation and intermarriage had ultimately produced. The search commenced with county records, but these proved nearly worthless. The Jacksons had avoided all official documentation throughout their existence. No birth certificates existed anywhere. No marriage licenses had ever been filed. No property deeds had been recorded after 1850. The family had essentially erased itself from civilization's paperwork, existing in a shadow world where laws and customs held absolutely no sway. Local residents provided the first real leads. Elderly townspeople remembered stories their grandparents had told, whispered tales about the Jackson Hollow where strange sounds echoed on quiet nights, and anyone venturing too close was chased away by fierce dogs and fiercer people. A shopkeeper recalled that twice yearly, usually in spring and fall, a Jackson would appear in town to trade furs and handmade items for salt, sugar, and ammunition. These visits were brief and unsettling affairs. The Jacksons never spoke more than absolutely necessary, and their appearance, pale skin, unusual features, outdated clothing marked them as people from another time entirely. "Last time I seen one was maybe 1935, the shopkeeper told investigators. Young woman couldn't have been more than 20, but her face was all wrong somehow. Eyes too far apart, mouth twisted. She bought salt and matches, paid with a silver dollar from 1887, and disappeared back into the woods. Never saw her again. Following the old footpath Deputy Clayton had used, the investigation team ventured into the mountains during late November 1947. They brought camping equipment, medical supplies, and cameras to document whatever they might discover. The journey consumed most of a day, climbing steep ridges and crossing icy streams. The forest seemed to resist their progress intentionally, as if nature itself wanted to keep the Jackson secrets buried forever. They found the main cabin first, the one where Marie's records had been discovered. But this marked merely the beginning. Deeper into the hollow, they discovered 4 additional structures, each in varying states of decay. One appeared to have burned years before. Another had collapsed entirely, its timbers rotting into the earth. But 2 showed signs of recent occupation. The larger of these active cabins had smoke rising from its chimney. As the team approached, dogs began barking immediately. 3 large mixed breed animals charged toward them with bared teeth. Dr. Cartwright raised his rifle but held his fire. The dogs stopped short of attacking, forming a barrier while continuing to bark furiously. Then a figure emerged from the cabin. A woman perhaps 40 years old, perhaps 60. It was impossible to determine with certainty. She stood tiny, barely 5 tall, with a hunched back curving her spine unnaturally. Her face bore the unmistakable signs of genetic compression. Eyes set too closely together, a protruding lower jaw, ears positioned asymmetrically on her skull. She wore a dress that might have been fashionable in 1880, patched countless times with mismatched fabric. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice high and strained. "This is Jackson land. You got no right being here." Patricia Morrison stepped forward, hands visible and empty. "We're from the county, madam. We're here to help. We found records suggesting your family might need assistance." The woman laughed, a sound completely without humor. "Help? Ain't nobody helped us in 80 years. Ain't nobody wanted to. We're Jacksons. We take care of our own." Sheriff Hodges tried a different approach entirely. "What's your name?" "Ruth Jackson." "My mama was Elizabeth Jackson. Her mama was Marie. You found Grandma Marie's box, didn't you? She always said someone would someday." Ruth invited them inside, though her hospitality felt more like resignation than genuine welcome. The cabin's interior was shockingly primitive by any standard. No electricity, no running water, a single room divided by hanging blankets into sleeping areas. The smell proved overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, wood smoke, and something sickeningly sweet that Dr. Cartwright later identified as infected wounds left untreated for far too long. 3 other people inhabited the cabin. Ruth's brother Samuel, a man in his 40s whose legs were so twisted that he moved by dragging himself across the floor using his arms. Ruth's daughter Naomi, aged 22, who appeared cognitively delayed and spoke in simple childlike sentences despite her adult years. And Naomi's son, a boy of about 5 named Thomas, who bore such severe physical abnormalities that Dr. Cartwright had to step outside momentarily to compose himself. Young Thomas could neither walk nor speak. His skull was misshapen, elongated in the back and flattened on one side. His eyes did not track movement properly. His hands possessed only 3 fingers each, fused together in ways suggesting incomplete development within the womb. Yet he remained alert, making sounds and responding to his mother's voice with what appeared to be genuine recognition and affection. Over the following 2 days, the investigators documented absolutely everything. Dr. Cartwright conducted examinations, noting symptoms consistent with generations of close inbreeding, skeletal deformities, organ malformations, neurological impairments, immune system failures. Patricia Morrison interviewed each family member individually, piecing together their family tree, a document that revealed the full horror of the Jackson isolation. Ruth explained their history with surprising clarity and awareness. After Marie's death in 1933, the family had dwindled significantly. Disease, accidents, and the simple failure of bodies to function properly had claimed most of them. Ruth and Samuel were among the last of Marie's grandchildren surviving. Naomi was Ruth's daughter by her brother Samuel, continuing the pattern that had defined the family for 3 full generations. Thomas's father was also Samuel, perpetuating the cycle further. "We know it ain't right," Ruth said quietly during one interview. "We know what we are, but we're all we got. The outside world don't want us, and we don't know how to be in it. This hollow is our prison and our home both. We're born here and we die here, and in between we just survive somehow." The investigators found graves scattered throughout the property, unmarked except for rough stones placed atop them. They counted 47, though Dr. Cartwright estimated there might be twice that many given how long the family had lived in complete isolation. The infant mortality rate must have been catastrophic, he noted in his reports. Most children probably never survived their first year at all. Sheriff Hodges asked the question everyone was thinking simultaneously. Why didn't you leave? Why didn't anyone ever try to get help? Ruth's answer came simple and devastating. Where would we go looking like this, being what we are? They'd lock us up or worse. At least here we're free to be monsters in peace. The documentation compiled by Dr. Cartwright and his team revealed a genetic catastrophe unparalleled in American medical history. Using Marie Jackson's meticulous records, combined with testimonies from living family members, they reconstructed a family tree that illustrated exactly what happens when human bloodlines fold inward upon themselves for multiple successive generations. The Jackson isolation began in 1847 when Jeremiah and Martha Jackson homesteaded the remote Kentucky Hollow. They were second cousins who had left Virginia after family disapproval of their marriage. In the mountains, they found privacy, but also complete isolation from the outside world. They produced 9 children, 6 of whom survived to adulthood. Already the genetic foundation was compromised, narrower than healthy populations actually require. When Jeremiah and Martha died in a flash flood during 1868, their children faced a crucial life decision. The nearest town lay a full day's journey distant, and they had never integrated into any community whatsoever. The eldest son, Thomas, was 23. His sister, Elizabeth, was 21. Rather than separate or seek outside connections, they formed a union that would doom all their descendants irrevocably. Thomas and Elizabeth produced 8 children between 1869 and 1884. 5 survived past infancy. Marie, born in 1871, was among those survivors. Dr. Cartwright's analysis of Marie's descriptions showed that even this first generation of sibling offspring displayed concerning symptoms. Hearing loss, vision problems, skeletal irregularities, delayed development. But these were mild compared to what would eventually come. Marie's generation continued the pattern simply because they knew nothing else existed anywhere. Isolated from birth, raised by parents who were also siblings, they possessed no concept of the genetic danger they faced. Marie had children with 2 of her brothers. Her sisters had children with their brothers. The family tree stopped branching entirely and became a tangle of lines connecting the same names over and over repeatedly. By the 3rd generation, the one Ruth belonged to, the physical manifestations had become severe indeed. Dr. Cartwright documented cases that would have been medically impossible without extreme genetic compression occurring. One of Ruth's cousins had been born with his heart positioned on the wrong side of his chest. Another possessed a cleft skull, leaving part of his brain exposed, surviving somehow until age 12. A sister had been born with her digestive system incompletely formed, dying in agony at age 3. The pattern accelerated with each passing generation. Harmful recessive genes, normally diluted in diverse populations, became concentrated instead. The Jackson bloodline was essentially breeding defects into itself, amplifying genetic mutations that would have remained hidden in normal family structures. Dr. Cartwright identified markers consistent with at least 15 different genetic disorders, all occurring within a single family group simultaneously. Ruth's daughter Naomi represented the 4th generation of this genetic collapse. Her cognitive delays, her physical malformations, her son's severe disabilities. These were the inevitable result of a family tree that had become a closed loop entirely. Dr. Cartwright calculated that Naomi's coefficient of inbreeding, a measure of genetic similarity between parents, was approximately 0.375, equivalent to a child born from a father-daughter union. Young Thomas's coefficient was even higher, approaching 0.5, a level typically observed only in laboratory animals bred for specific traits generation after generation. The social worker, Patricia Morrison, documented the psychological impact alongside the physical suffering. The surviving Jacksons lived with profound shame and isolation constantly. They understood in their own way that they were different, damaged, wrong somehow. Ruth spoke about this with heartbreaking clarity during one interview. "We know what we are," she repeated. "My mama told me stories about the old days when Grandma Marie's brothers and sisters were still alive. She said there used to be music in the hollow, singing and dancing, but as we got fewer and sicker, the music stopped. Now there's just silence and waiting for the end." Morrison asked if Ruth had ever wanted children with someone outside the family. Ruth's response was chilling indeed. "I never seen nobody outside the family except when I went to town twice. And when people saw me, they looked scared or disgusted. I knew I couldn't have nothing with them. Samuel and I, we're the same. We understand each other. Our children might be sick, but they're ours and they're loved. That's more than the world would give us, I reckon." The investigation team discovered that the Jacksons had developed their own understanding of their tragic situation. They knew that close relations produced sick children. They had tried in limited ways to avoid the worst combinations possible. Ruth and Samuel were not full siblings, but half-siblings instead, sharing only a mother. This was their attempt at genetic diversity, utterly insufficient, but representing a dim awareness of cause and effect operating. Marie's records included heartbreaking passages where she tried convincing family members to leave, to find outsiders to marry, to break the terrible cycle somehow. But fear, shame, and practical limitations made this absolutely impossible. They possessed no education, no social skills, no way to integrate into normal society whatsoever. Their appearance marked them immediately as different from others. The outside world offered no welcome, only judgment and harsh rejection. Dr. Cartwright wrote in his final report, "The Jackson family represents a complete failure of isolation. Human beings are not meant to exist in genetic bubbles. We require diversity to survive, to thrive, to maintain the complex biological systems that make us viable. The Jacksons are slowly dying out, not through any single cause, but through the accumulated weight of genetic debt that can never be repaid. Each generation is weaker than the last, more prone to disease, more likely to die young, more severely impacted by the choices made 80 years ago by people who simply didn't know better. Now, I need you to pause this video momentarily and do something important. In the comments below, write exactly this phrase: "The mountain holds our shame." And if Marie's story has genuinely touched your heart, if you understand the tragedy of isolation and the cost of hidden secrets, share these words with others. Let me see who's truly connecting with these forgotten histories we explore. The investigation revealed one final disturbing detail. The Jacksons were not entirely unique. Throughout Appalachia, scattered in remote valleys and forgotten hollows, other families existed in similar isolation. Some had been there for generations, their genetic foundations eroding invisibly until problems became impossible to ignore any longer. The Jackson case was simply the most thoroughly documented, the one that happened to leave records behind for discovery. The state of Kentucky faced an unprecedented dilemma when the full scope of the Jackson situation became clear. 4 people remained in the hollow: Ruth, Samuel, Naomi, and young Thomas. All required medical attention. All needed social services intervention. But what kind of intervention was appropriate for people whose entire existence had been defined by isolation from society? Dr. Cartwright argued for immediate relocation to a medical facility where proper treatment could be provided. Samuel's infected leg wounds were potentially life-threatening conditions. Thomas needed specialist care that was absolutely impossible in the primitive cabin setting. Even Ruth, the most functional of the survivors, showed signs of malnutrition and untreated chronic conditions requiring attention. But Patricia Morrison raised concerns about the psychological impact of forced removal from everything familiar. These people had never lived anywhere else at all. The hollow represented their entire world completely. Taking them from it might cause more harm than the physical benefits of medical care could possibly address. She advocated for a gradual approach instead, providing supplies and occasional medical visits, while respecting their autonomy and choices. Sheriff Hodges represented a third perspective entirely. From a legal standpoint, the relationships within the Jackson family violated Kentucky's laws against certain familial unions. But prosecuting people who had lived in complete ignorance of such laws seemed both cruel and pointless simultaneously. What purpose would punishment possibly serve? The family had already suffered more than any court could ever hope to inflict. The debate played out in state offices and newspapers throughout early 1948. The Jackson case became a sensation, though authorities tried protecting the family's identity from exploitation. Journalists descended on Harlan County, seeking the story eagerly. Some portrayed the Jacksons as victims of geography and circumstance primarily. Others used more sensational language, referring to them as examples of American degeneracy, hidden shameful secrets contradicting the nation's self-image of progress and civilization. In March 1948, a compromise was finally reached. The state would provide medical supplies, food, and regular visits from a nurse and social worker. Ruth and her family could remain in the hollow if they chose, but they would receive support regardless. Additionally, young Thomas would be offered special education services, though implementing this in such a remote location would prove challenging indeed. Ruth accepted these terms with visible relief apparent. She had feared being taken away, institutionalized, separated from the only home she had ever known. The prospect of help without displacement felt like an unexpected mercy granted. "We don't want to be a burden," she told Patricia Morrison. "But if you're willing to help us without taking everything away, we're grateful for that." The state nurse, a woman named Elenina Banks, began monthly visits in April 1948. Her journals from this period provide a ground-level view of the Jackson family's daily reality unfolding. She treated Samuel's leg infections, which proved resistant to antibiotics due to his compromised immune system functioning. She taught Ruth better sanitation practices, though the lack of running water made this difficult indeed. She brought vitamins and nutritional supplements, slowly improving their overall health condition. Elenina grew particularly attached to Naomi, who, despite her cognitive limitations, showed warmth and humor consistently. Naomi loved music deeply, humming constantly and creating simple songs about the birds and seasons passing. She cared for Thomas with unwavering devotion, attending to his needs with patience that Eleanor found genuinely moving. She may not understand complex ideas, Eleanor wrote, but she understands love completely, and she gives it without reservation daily. Thomas began receiving special attention from a specialist who made the difficult journey to the Hollow 4 times during that first year. Dr. Ellen Foster, a pediatric neurologist from Louisville, assessed Thomas's condition and concluded that while his physical limitations were permanent, his cognitive abilities were better than initially thought possible. He could learn, albeit slowly, and he responded well to structured interaction with others. Through spring and summer of 1948, the Jackson family's situation gradually stabilized. They were healthier, better fed, and no longer facing their challenges entirely alone as before. Ruth began to trust the outsiders who came to help, sharing stories about her grandmother Marie, about the family's long history, about the hollows and ridges that had been their entire universe for generations. But tragedy struck in September 1948 unexpectedly. Samuel developed pneumonia, his weakened lungs unable to fight the infection effectively. Eleanor Banks arrived to find him barely conscious, fever raging uncontrollably. She radioed for emergency evacuation immediately, but the weather was deteriorating rapidly. Heavy rains made the mountain paths absolutely impossible to navigate. By the time help arrived 2 days later, Samuel had already died. His death devastated Ruth and Naomi completely. Samuel had been the family's provider, the one strong enough to hunt and trap effectively, to maintain the cabin properly, to perform the physical labor their survival required absolutely. Without him, their situation became precarious indeed. Ruth, with her curved spine and limited mobility, could not do what Samuel had done consistently. The state would need to increase support substantially, or the family would have to leave the Hollow behind permanently. Ruth made the decision in October 1948. She would move with Naomi and Thomas to a small house the state provided in the town of Harland. It was time, she said, to stop hiding from the world. Marie's records had been found and read. The secret was finally out completely. Maybe it was time for the Jacksons to try living in the world, even if the world found them strange and frightening to behold. The transition was extraordinarily difficult in every way. Ruth had never lived in a house with electricity before. The constant hum of refrigerators and lights disturbed her deeply. Running water seemed like magic and waste simultaneously confusing. Neighbors stared openly, children pointed fingers, and despite Eleanor and Patricia's best efforts to prepare the community adequately, prejudice and fear were constant presences impossible to escape. Naomi struggled even more profoundly. The noise of town life overwhelmed her senses completely. She spent hours hiding in closets, hands over her ears, rocking back and forth repeatedly. Thomas paradoxically seemed to adapt better, perhaps because he had less to unlearn initially. The regular medical care improved his health noticeably over time. A physical therapist began working with him, developing exercises to strengthen his limited mobility gradually. Ruth gave several interviews in late 1948, carefully managed by Patricia Morrison to prevent exploitation by others. She spoke about her grandmother's records, about the choice to document their family's decline, about the hope that someone would understand, rather than simply condemn them outright. "We didn't choose this," Ruth said in one interview. "We were born into it, but maybe by being honest about what happened to us, we can help make sure it don't happen to nobody else going forward." The Jackson case did have broader impacts eventually. Kentucky strengthened its rural outreach programs significantly, ensuring that isolated families received regular contact and support services. Medical screening programs expanded to remote areas, identifying genetic risks earlier than before. Social workers received training on how to assist families in extreme isolation without judgment or force applied. Marie Jackson's records were preserved by the State Historical Society, a document of immense medical and social significance overall. Researchers began studying them extensively, not with morbid curiosity driving them, but with genuine scientific interest in understanding how isolation and genetic compression affect human populations over time. The Jackson case became a cautionary tale taught in medical schools and social work programs across the entire country. Ruth Jackson lived in Harlan until her death in 1967 at age 62 years. Those 19 years outside the Hollow were marked by both progress and persistent challenges throughout. She never fully adapted to town life completely, always seeming slightly out of place, slightly bewildered by a world that had changed so much from the one her great-grandparents had left behind in 1847. But she persisted regardless, driven by a determination that her family's suffering would mean something ultimately, would teach lessons that mattered going forward. Naomi remained dependent on Ruth's care throughout those years entirely. She never developed the skills necessary for independent living whatsoever, her cognitive limitations too severe to overcome despite patient teaching and support services provided. But she found joy in simple things consistently. The television Ruth eventually learned to operate properly. The visits from Elenina Banks, who remained a family friend throughout. The church services she attended, where hymns reminded her of the songs her mother had sung in the Hollow long ago. Young Thomas lived to age 23, far longer than anyone ever expected initially. The medical care he received in town extended his life significantly, though it could not cure his fundamental genetic issues underlying everything. He learned to communicate through simple signs and sounds effectively. He recognized people he loved clearly. He smiled when music played regularly. When he died in 1970 from heart failure, a complication of his congenital defects, a small group attended his funeral service. Ruth, Naomi Elenina, Patricia Morrison, and a handful of church members who had known the family personally. Thomas was the last Jackson born in the Hollow. With his death, the genetic line that had collapsed inward for 4 generations finally ended completely. Ruth had never had more children after leaving the mountains behind. Naomi's only child was Thomas himself, the family that had persisted in isolation for 80 years, that had documented its own decline meticulously, that had survived against tremendous odds consistently, was finally extinct altogether. But the story didn't end with Thomas's funeral service. The impact of Marie Jackson's records continued to resonate through medical research, social policy, and public understanding of genetic health issues. Dr. Cartwright published multiple papers on the Jackson case, always maintaining the family's anonymity while sharing the crucial medical data obtained. His work contributed to broader understanding of how isolated populations develop genetic vulnerabilities over time. In 1975, the Kentucky State Legislature passed laws requiring genetic counseling for communities at risk of isolation-related health issues. The Jackson Act, as it was informally known, mandated outreach programs to remote areas, education about genetic diversity importance, and support services for families dealing with hereditary conditions. It wasn't perfect legislation, but it represented an acknowledgement that isolation itself could be a form of harm, that communities had responsibility to ensure no family suffered as the Jacksons had suffered. Patricia Morrison, who retired from social work in 1978, wrote a book about her experiences with the Jackson family. Hollow, a family's story of isolation and survival, became required reading in social work programs nationwide. She emphasized the dignity and humanity of the people she had served, pushing back against sensationalism that portrayed them as mere curiosities or cautionary tales only. They were people, she wrote, people who loved and hoped and tried to survive in impossible circumstances. They deserved to be remembered as such, with compassion. Eulalinina Banks continued nursing in Appalachia until her retirement in 1982. She kept photographs of Ruth, Naomi, and Thomas in her office constantly, reminders of why her work mattered deeply. In interviews near the end of her life, she spoke about how the Jackson case had changed her understanding of healthcare fundamentally. Medicine isn't just about treating disease, she said. It's about understanding the whole person, their history, their context, their humanity. The Jacksons taught me that lesson permanently. The hollow where the Jackson family lived for 8 decades was eventually reclaimed by the forest entirely. The cabins collapsed gradually, vegetation covered the clearings completely, and the paths that had connected the family to the outside world faded into the landscape permanently. In 1995, the state of Kentucky designated the area as a protected natural site, preventing development and ensuring that the place where this tragic history unfolded would remain undisturbed forever. A small memorial was erected near the old homestead in 2001, though reaching it requires a difficult hike still. The plaque reads, "Here lived the Jackson family, 1847-1948. Their story reminds us of the importance of connection, the dangers of isolation, and the resilience of the human spirit, even in the darkest circumstances. May we learn from their experience and ensure that no family suffers such loneliness again." Researchers occasionally visit the site even now, documenting the ruins, searching for artifacts that might provide additional insights. In 2015, a team found remains of the original cabin built by Jeremiah and Martha Jackson in 1847. The structure that had started everything unfolding. Preserved in the foundation stones were carved initials JJ and MJ 1847. A simple declaration of presence from people who could not have imagined what their choice of isolation would produce 4 generations later. The medical significance of the Jackson case continues to inform genetic research currently, in an era when DNA testing and genetic analysis have become routine procedures. The Jackson family tree serves as a vivid illustration of why genetic diversity matters fundamentally. Medical students study their case to understand recessive genetic conditions thoroughly. Genetic counselors reference it when explaining risks to families with limited gene pools. The tragedy that Marie Jackson so carefully documented continues to educate and inform, turning private suffering into public knowledge that saves lives ultimately. But perhaps the most lasting legacy is simply the memory of Ruth's words spoken in one of her final interviews before her death. Asked what she wanted people to understand about her family, she said, "We were real people. We loved each other genuinely. We did the best we could with what we knew at the time. We were trapped by things that happened before we were born, but we were still human beings with feelings and dreams inside us. Don't let us just be a sad story people tell. Let us be a reminder that every person, no matter how different or damaged, deserves compassion and help when needed. That's all we ever needed, really. That's all anyone needs fundamentally." Marie Jackson's records are still preserved in the Kentucky Historical Society archives currently. Researchers must request special permission to view them, and they are never allowed to photograph the fragile pages. But those who make the effort find a document of extraordinary power waiting. A woman's desperate attempt to make sense of her family's suffering, to document the undocumented thoroughly, to ensure that their existence mattered to someone, somewhere, somehow, eventually. They discovered Marie Jackson's records in 1947, and the Appalachians were never the same afterward. Not because the discovery changed the mountains themselves physically, but because it changed how we understand isolation, family, and the invisible ways that choices echo through generations continuously. The Jackson family's story is American history at its most raw and uncomfortable presentation. A reminder that behind every isolated community, every forgotten hollow, every family that seems to exist outside of time, there are real people living real lives, trapped by circumstances often beyond their control, deserving of recognition and compassion, even when their stories make us deeply uncomfortable inside. If you've watched until the end of this powerful and tragic story, you've witnessed something few people truly understand deeply. Before you go, do 3 things for me. First, make sure you're subscribed to this channel because stories like this need to be told, remembered, and learned from continuously. Second, leave a comment below saying, "I watched until the end," so I can see who truly connects with these hidden histories and appreciates the depth of human experience we explore here together. Third, give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who needs to understand that behind every historical tragedy are real people whose experiences matter deeply, whose suffering deserves